Hello and good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for coming here on the Monday morning. On the Monday, just the third day of the forum. A lot of people have probably used the opportunity to socialize a little bit with some friends, to network, and so 9 o'clock seems, or 9:30 rather, seems to be a bit early. Anyway, very nice to see you all. We have a very exciting panel, 5 people, 1 hour. There's not going to be a little bit in-depth conversation, but we are really looking forward to be able to discuss the subject which we have defined as being the improving partnership and equitable governance of Mediterranean natural resources. Now, as some of you remember, just to give a bit of context, at the latest in-person United Nations General Assembly, a group of NGOs and government went together and decided to, got together and decided to launch an appeal, a call to action. I will, if you allow me, read out the description of the call to action for a clear and overarching natural positive global goal for nature that could be integrated with other global goals to create and that's the important bit, an equitable, carbon neutral, nature positive world. Now, today we want to take this call to action and translate it to the Mediterranean. I do have an agenda which is undoubtedly going to appear on your screen very soon, and we will make sure that we follow it as much as possible. You might remember that at the time of the call to action, there were 3 different steps, 3 steps which were prepared as being the important steps of what the appeal should result into. One was a zero net loss of nature for 2020, so we are right in the middle of it, and you know maybe that's something that the panelists want to address. The second is to have a net positive by 2030. So again, that's not very far away. I'd be grateful if we can discuss that during this panel as well. And then the most ambitious goal of them, the full recovery of nature by 2050. Now, these are of course general directions which we are going to now try to translate to the Mediterranean region. And as we all know, the Mediterranean has a particularly important role to play, not only in our collective history, but also in the fact that it is one of the biodiversity hotspots on the planet, which is under serious threat for all sorts of reasons. Of course, you might hear that from my voice. I have a little bit of a Oh, thank you very much. I have a little bit of a French accent when I speak. I come from, I grew up in the south of France. In fact, I grew up very close to here. And it is a region which I consider as being exemplary in a number of levels, and in particular in the fact that it is, for the Western Hemisphere, the base of history as we know it, the base of democracy, the base of collective life around the common resources. What the Romans used to call the Mare Nostrum is the source of was the source for many years of the prosperity of the region. So a very interesting place to talk about nature influence, and prosperity, which I'm thinking are intimately linked. To discuss this issue, we are very lucky to have a very exciting panel. I mean, really, you know, I'm trying to sort of wake you up on Monday morning. These are exciting people, and you should really recognize them. So I'm going to introduce them one by one, and I will go off the biography so that I don't make too many mistakes. On my right, ready to talk, is the CEO, the Deputy CEO, is that right? Of the Capitals Coalition, and he will explain to you what this means with helps of 2 slides. Then we have Marco Lambertini, CEO of WWF International. I don't think we need to introduce the panda. I think everybody knows what WWF is. Then we have, and these 2 represent NGOs in many ways. Then we have Helen Crowley from Caring. Your exact title is you're Head of Sustainable and Innovation at Caring. Is that correct? So you don't have a microphone. You don't have a microphone, so you cannot contradict me. That's very good news. That's why I chair this series. Sustainable sourcing, maybe, no? Sustainable. Yeah, I couldn't read my notes anymore. Sorry. And then we have Akanksha KHATRI, who works for the World Economic Forum in Geneva, and there her role is that she's the head of Nature Action Agenda for the global public goods. So very nice to have you here. Thank you for coming. And finally, we have a representative of government. We have Monsieur Stéphane PAILLER, who is the Deputy Director of Environment and Climate at the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs of the Government of France. Thank you. No, this has been typed, so I can read it. So, well, let me please kick off this conversation by making sure that I give each one of you the opportunity to address, and I suggest we frame it around these three targets, these three temporal targets of the local government, of the call to action that I've described before. So, Martin, can I perhaps ask you to kick us off?
Yes, thank you very much, André, and thank you also for having me here in this wonderful panel. First, let me say to become carbon neutral and nature positive is of course not a new ambition. We are kind of re-bringing it to the table again and again. And one of the key reasons why we are not achieving it, and achieving a target is much more difficult than agreeing on a target, we all know that. One of the key reasons for not achieving it is that we base all the decisions that we make within society on incomplete information. So we don't take the value of nature and people into account. And I work for the Capitals Coalition. We are a coalition, a global collaboration, as you can see here, over 400 organizations, from business, from finance, from governments, from accountants, from science, from the conservation community, over 20,000 people collaborating with us, and we come together around one joint ambition, and that is to change the way how decisions are made by embedding the value of nature and people into those decisions. Not only for the Mediterranean, but for the whole world. So that's a small task for a Monday morning. Can I have the next slide, please? So the key thing what we found out is that if you don't have a joint understanding of how to value nature and people, you're kind of in Babylonia. And it is especially important to have a joint understanding between business, finance and governments. And why is that? You see here an infinity loop we use to explain that. Business is doing more and more good work to set targets, to figure out how can we measure and value our impact and dependencies on nature. And then they are deciding and acting and changing the way how they use nature. So probably Helen from Caring will give some examples how they do that. But then also this information, if it's shared outside the company, the financial community takes it on, it uses that information to assess the relevance of them, to the risks, the opportunities, they start to rate and benchmark and also start to make some changes in their internal systems. And then the third party coming on board is of course government that can adapt its regulation or its incentive mechanisms on the basis of this. So what we do as Capitals Coalition is to bring all these partners together. We develop guidelines, we have the Natural Capital Protocol, loads of specific guidances for the agricultural sector, for apparel, around biodiversity for the financial sector. Please go to our website, capitalscoalition.org, you will find all the information. You will also find loads of case studies where businesses and financial institutions explain what they are doing. And I want to highlight a couple of those. One which still needs to come up, but I want to start with that because it is in the middle of the Mediterranean, a marine protected area near Mallorca. And they just finished, one of the consultants in our community, they finished a natural capital account for that marine protected area with the outcome that every euro that you would invest in the marine protected area generates 10 euros of benefits. So you can understand that that kind of information will be helpful to guide decisions in the direction of supporting the conservation of that marine protected area. Another example I want to share with you, and let's go to Greece now. And this is one of my favorite examples. It's from the Piraeus Bank, and it's in Lake Stymphalia. And for those of you who really are classical, you know Lake Stymphalia is where Hercules did his 6th job because he had to kill all those birds that killed people with metal feathers and with poisonous dung. So I really like this story, but the ecosystem, of course, with all those birds there is not in a very good shape. So the Piraeus Bank used natural capital accounting as a way to understand where are the opportunities, what kind of sectors could make a profit out of this area if it is more in a more healthy state, and then tourism as one of the opportunities clearly popped up, and they started to create business proposals around that for this area to help the ecosystem to restore. So I think that's also a great example. And the last one I wanted to mention is BNP Paribas, one of the biggest asset managers in the world. We all know that. They use natural capital approaches to start having discussions with their clients that lend their money. And it is very simple. They use natural capital to kind of check who's doing the right thing for nature and for climate, and who's doing the wrong thing. They use this specifically for climate, mitigation and adaptation measures. And on the basis of that, they started, for example, within their portfolio with chemicals. 3 of 20 of the companies got a bonus, but more got a malus for that, a 30 plus or 30 minus percentage of a difference in the way how the ESG criteria were rated by BNP Paribas. And also for agri companies or for the built environment, you see the same numbers, that part of their portfolio gets a plus and the other gets a minus, and even some get in real trouble in the sense that they will not get money if they don't change their behavior. So 3 examples from the Mediterranean area, and how they can help if the information is better and complete regarding the value of nature and people. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. And I particularly like this association of prosperity and correlated with Hercules and the big works of Hercules. I mean, we're going to have to lift an enormous amount of things if you want to reconcile this notion of prosperity and a well-functioning environment. Marco, if I could pass the mic to you now, what I would like to talk about, of course, is this idea of what does actually natural positive mean, or natural equal mean. We had the opportunity, Helen and I, to discuss that briefly before, and I think we would benefit from some clarification on the subject. Sorry to put you on the spot, but good luck.
I'm used to you putting me on the spot, so I'm not bothered anymore. But thank you. No, in fact, is a good opportunity to talk a little bit what drives this push for a nature positive global goal for nature. Think about carbon neutral, which is now the already established global goal for climate. And think about the disruption that global goal that sets a goal of net zero emissions by 2050 has done to the energy sector. What we are seeing today, not fast enough, I agree already with you on that, but what we are seeing today is a massive shift towards a different way of producing energy, towards a different way to power our economy. Electrification, renewable energy is coming up prepotently on the stage, with divestment for fossil fuel happening every day more, with the investment in innovation that improves even further the technology on renewable energy. We need to see the same disruption. We need to see a global goal that drives the same disruption in other economic drivers of nature loss. Top of the list, the food systems, agriculture and fishing. Then infrastructure, then forestry and extractives. Those are the key drivers today of nature loss. Without changing those drivers, we can't achieve a nature positive future. So that's, André and everyone, is on one hand the reason for why we need a strong, ambitious, disruptive global goal for nature, because we need to force an economic transition, nature positive transition of these sectors. Nature positive is achieved, to simplify, into 3 big streams, like 3 pillars. The first one is spaces. We're losing a lot. We lost half of the forest, half of the coral reefs, 80% of the wetlands. We continue to convert natural spaces into non-ecologically productive spaces. And although, of course, we need some of these productive spaces for our own economy, we're going far too far. We are not effective, we're not efficient, we're destroying too much, and we are wasteful, and that has to change. We need to move into a sustainable agriculture, sustainable fishing activities, and that's the first dimension of nature positive. Activities that avoid the destruction on the remaining natural habitats. There is a target for that already emerging. At least 30% protection of land and sea Today, the world is protecting 15% on land and less than 10% on the ocean. The Mediterranean is even behind. The Mediterranean is, particularly in the sea, in the ocean, or in the sea of the Mediterranean, is protecting less than 10% and effectively protecting less than 2%. So this is one first point. In the Mediterranean, there is a protection agenda, conservation agenda, marine protected areas that has to increase. And as Martin said earlier, it is very clear today that protecting is actually helping the fishing industry to be more productive. That's the important paradigm, and that's an important link between nature positive and the equitable dimension of our strapline, if you like, carbon neutral, nature positive, equitable. When you go to the footprint, things are more complicated, of course. If you look at the Mediterranean, at sea, clearly fishing is the main sector that needs to be regulated, not just through protected areas, which, as I said, needs to increase, but also through fishing practices. We need to really contain the destructive fishing practices that today are depleting marine living resources. And that's an area of focus. Trolling, long lining, drift nets still illegally operating in many areas in the Mediterranean and also legally in others. All these practices needs to be relooked at. And finally, the big challenge, because the Mediterranean is not a bubble on its own. It's connected to the rest of the landscape. And so really tackling the issue of agriculture, runoffs and agricultural runoffs, the pollution that agriculture provides is a massive challenge that needs to be integrated in a Mediterranean plan. The European Union has developed the EU Green Deal that is very ambitious in terms of shifting from the current chemical intensive destructive agriculture to a much more regenerative and natural based agriculture. And focusing on that is going to be a great benefit for the Mediterranean as well. And finally, the issue of the infrastructure that has been a major driver of natural loss on the coast of the Mediterranean, with impact on the ecosystems of the Mediterranean itself as well. Again, the European Union, as we are proud to have contributed to that, and with other organizations, we have has adopted a new taxonomy for sustainable investment in infrastructure. And we had actually yesterday a panel with a number of financial institutions and development banks that are really beginning to rise to the challenge of developing stronger safeguards for infrastructure that is needed in some cases not, but when is needed is actually developed with very stringent criteria to minimize the impact, because there will be a tsunami of infrastructure, particularly in developing countries, of course, to happen in the next 10 years. And without fixing that problem, together with the rest I just mentioned, we're not going to have a nature positive or a Mediterranean nature positive future.
Well, thank you, Marco. That was absolutely masterful. It gave us a good idea of the problems facing us. Now we would like this panel to concentrate on potential solutions. And so...
is that all? Okay.
I know that, Helen, as a representative of industry, commerce and business, whatever word you want to give it, you're probably getting this sort of... I personally get it all the time. What is business doing? What can we do? Doing? How can we define the issue, and how can we make some solution going forward? So we don't expect a universal solution from you, but hearing about what can be done would be, I think, very helpful, by giving it a positive slant, please, because I'm rather pro-business, in case you didn't know. So, yeah.
Thank you, André. Lovely to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. And so let me just, I'll start with firstly positioning what we're doing at Kering. So Kering's a global luxury group that has 14 brands. Gucci is probably the one that you mostly know, but several others. And we have, for 10 years, I have been working there in the corporate sustainability department. Actually, my title keeps changing, so it's okay that sometimes I have to remember. It's now Head of Sustainable Sourcing and Nature Initiatives, which I'm very proud of because I'm actually a conservation biologist by training. So I love that I have nature in my title. But so from the very beginning, we sort of had this vision of not just doing less bad, but doing more good, and we were like, okay, what does that look like? And what we had as a framing, and I'm going to get back to this because we need framing for action. We haven't got a lot of time we can't afford to get things wrong. We need to focus on the right things to do. So what happened 10 years ago is we put in an environment profit and loss account, which is a natural capital account, and that gave us a framework for how to act and where to act. It showed that 70% of our footprint, and I'm not talking specifically about biodiversity, it was more environment footprint, because that's sort of a proxy for our impact on nature and our dependency on nature, by the way, but it measured more of an impact, showed that 70% of our footprint or more some years was in our raw material sourcing. So it was where we grow our leather, our wool, our cashmere, our silk, our cotton, and that was where we need to focus attention. So that sort of started us on this pathway. If you want to start to do less bad and more good, this was before we started all talking about nature positive, we needed to understand where do we start going lower and lower on impact, and where can we deliver positive change. So over the decade we've sort of explored that more and more, and of course the global conversation has got more and more interesting and sophisticated around this idea of moving to positive, that we can't just afford to do less bad, we can't just afford to reduce the negative, we've got to restore and regenerate. So for us that means looking at those agricultural solutions. It means that we don't focus so much in the protected areas, that 30%, which is really important and critical, but we help reduce the pressure on that 30%, and we play in the 70%. Our playing field is the 70%, the agricultural lands, and we don't take raw materials from the oceans, but we affect the oceans through the way we use the land. So we've been focusing, what does it look like to be nature positive in the land, in agriculture? How do you do wildlife friendly practices that is not just about the soil and regenerating the soil, which with what have we got, less than 60 years left of soil, 60 harvests left, so it's super important that we do the soil. But it's not just about the soil, it's about what grows on top of the soil. How do we increase plant diversity? How do we allow wildlife to move across agricultural landscapes and coexist? And we're all on this adventure together. It's sort of a new endeavour in the last couple of years for us at Caring, but more and more companies, One Planet Business for Biodiversity, 27 companies are committing to biodiversity conservation through an agricultural lens, through not only just avoiding any new conversion of natural habitats, but also restoring diversity of those agricultural landscapes, restoring the biodiversity in the land. So there's this really exciting movement from companies that they're mostly food companies, but also cosmetics companies. And I see Vanessa in the audience from Pernod Ricard, who have a really ambitious agenda on regenerative agriculture, really looking at that's where our interface for business and nature is at this agricultural landscape. So what does nature positive look like in those landscapes? We launched a regenerative fund for nature earlier this year. Isn't it funny how the years just sort of get all merged over the last couple of years? Earlier this year, to put out a challenge to get to fund innovative regenerative agricultural projects, because we're still trying to figure this out. What does it look like to grow sheep leather in South Africa in a nature positive way? What does it look like to grow wool in Patagonia in a nature positive way? What does it look like to grow goat leather in Spain in a nature positive way? So there's some really exciting initiatives going on in the way we look at that sort of 70% in the agriculture, and what does nature positive look like? And it's not just sustainable, it's this restorative agenda. But just before I finish, I want to get back to the frameworks for action, because I think we have a brilliant vision. We have this vision, and Marco was eloquent in talking about what that vision and why we should have the vision. But I think to act, you have to have some clarity of what is it that I need to do where. What's my priority? What's my priorities? I mean, with Caring, like, we had our natural capital framework. And so I think this idea of avoid, to your points, André, of the sort of the three levels, what do we need to avoid? What do we need to reduce in terms of where do we need to restore and regenerate? But here's the thing, and this is, where do we need to go beyond what we're just doing at an individual level as a company or even a coalition of companies, and do more than the sum of the parts? Like, how do we be more transformative? Because it's all very well if, say, we did our entire supply chain was regenerative, which is what we're aiming for. Is that really going to get us to nature positive at a global level? And when I was sitting having breakfast watching the beautiful harbour in Marseille, I was thinking, okay, so what does nature positive look like for the Mediterranean? And I was thinking, what an interesting challenge. It's almost like a land use planning challenge at a biome level to say, okay, we've got all these great initiatives happening, and they're all great in their own right, but what does it look like to really build a vision across a biome of what nature positive? Where do we need to, like you said, there's areas we've got to protect, but where are there areas we've got to prioritise reduced impact? Where are there areas we're really going to prioritise restoration? And who do we engage in that? You know, there's the Pernod Ricards, the Carings, the L'Occitans, the OP2B, that can certain areas can be part of that big vision, and then we can create a framework for action. So I think this nature positive is not just powerful in the sense that it's a great mission and vision to get behind, but it also, there are frameworks for actions now with science-based targets and with the way we're talking about reducing and restoring and so on, that we can really rally sort of collaboration across vast landscapes so that we're more than the sum of our parts. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah, for this very passionate positioning. That was, I think we can give her a round of applause. No, I think she did that really well. She did that really well. Now, I equally feel passionate about this notion of saying that this is all about human prosperity in the Mediterranean basin, what we are discussing. How do we engage with nature? It's not just, I'm sorry, we are in the World Conservation Congress, but this is not just about conservation. This is about how we establish humanity and how we continue to create a sustainable system which will allow us to get prosperity for all when we are going to be 9 billion plus on the planet. So I'm very excited about Helen having said that. Now I'm going to give the floor to you, Akanksha. I mean, I will remind us that the World Economic Forum is the international organization for public-private cooperation, and therefore you can see my seating plan works beautifully. You know, you're exactly the person who needs to talk that before we speak with government. We just want to have public-private cooperation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, André. And I have to say, I'm a little nervous to go after that huge applause for Helen, which was so justly deserved. But
they were just being polite, don't worry.
No, so I'm just going to build on what all the three speakers have so eloquently put forward. I think we did hear about very specific cases from Martin, then we heard like a fantastic vision from Marco and clear examples from business. Maybe as André said, as the International Organization for Public-Private, let me take a little bit of a step back and also speak a little bit about systems transformation. Because Helen's point is absolutely right, that an individual player can only do so much. What we need is the entire system to change in a way that it starts to value nature and natural capital just the way it values human capital, financial capital, and produced capital. So maybe I'll take the examples of risks and opportunities because that's a language that I think both businesses and governments understand well. So if we look about risks, I think our report that came out last year identified that more than half the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature, which means that we are not talking about this from an environmental agenda alone, but a fundamental economic and societal priority. And in the last 1.5 years, this has become more and more clear. Then we move a little bit more towards opportunities, which helps us understand that doing this is also good for business and good for our society, because a nature positive pathway can unlock about $10.1 trillion of business opportunities. But where do these risks and opportunities actually sit is exactly what Marco was saying earlier. It's not only about getting to that outcome, but also starting to look at what are the drivers of nature loss. And the drivers of nature loss are anchored in 3 key socioeconomic systems, which is first, food, land and agriculture, second, infrastructure and the built environment, and third is extractives and energy. And I think across the program of this IUCN Congress, there is a huge amount of attention being put on the dimension of food, land and agriculture, and the impact that it has on nature. And I think we are talking a lot about innovation, coalitions and partnerships, but let's not forget farmers who really are the stewards of land and often get forgotten, because the transition that is required to a net zero, nature positive and socially equitable economy requires that we put the farmers and indigenous people right at the center. And today that equity is truly at risk. So if we think about the infrastructure and the built environment, the cities today account for only 3% of the total livable land. Yet they are responsible for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions and most of the consumption. So the way we design cities has to change. The pressures that cities put on nature has to shift. So we are quite delighted. I see that Christina from the Humboldt Institute in Colombia is also in the audience. We are delighted to be having launched a new initiative called Biodiverse Cities by 2030. So change the way we design and structure our cities so that we are putting less pressure on the 30% that Helen talked about. The second thing is about energy. So of course there's a huge effort, as Marco was saying, on shifting our energy sources to more renewable ones, and recognize that climate change is responsible for about 13 to 16% of nature loss. Where does the rest of it sit? It's actually in land use. So yes, focus on energy transition, it's super critical, but let's not forget the land use transition, which is equally responsible, if not more, if we have to move to a nature positive piece. And then the last piece that I want to leave with everybody is the power of coalitions and partnerships. Because frankly, we cannot do it alone. No business can do it alone. No government can do it alone. What we will need is truly blended finance and public-private partnerships to get to that vision that Marco talked about. So I'll leave it over there, but thanks again for having me and the forum on the panel.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Akanksha. That was excellent, and thank you for mentioning cities. I think if we talk about the Mediterranean context, we have to remember that some of the oldest cities in the world have originated on the side of the Mediterranean. They have raised their prosperity out of the Mediterranean, and that prosperity is now in doubt. I mean, Marseille is a good example. We are here at one of the most what can I say, human-friendly part of the universe, and we are not doing a good job out of it. So let's focus on practical experiences, and thank you very much, Monsieur Paillet, for your forthcoming remarks. I would suggest that after we've done this round of introductory talk, we will have a little bit of question between ourselves before we ask these guys. So you go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I don't think I expressed the voice of all the governments, but at least of France, regarding the Mediterranean. So I would like just to take this opportunity and this invitation for presenting a plan which is called the Mediterranean, a Sea Model by 2030, which is an action plan for the coming years, which was launched during that we call the One Planet Summit. So it was in Paris on the 11th of January 2021, and which was dedicated to the loss of biodiversity. And one of the main announcements of this One Planet Summit was the launching of negotiations on an action plan to preserve the marine biodiversity on the Mediterranean Sea in the coming years. So we started discussions with countries, 8 countries, especially from the western part of the Mediterranean Sea, and regional organizations, all of them concerning the Mediterranean. And so we share our views on how to respond to that challenge, preserving the biodiversity. And so we have achieved 20 actions, which are in different axes. So we've got 4 axes for that action plan. The first one is, and it was underlined by what you said, Mr. Lambertini. The first one is increasing the ambition for preserving marine and coastal biodiversity in the Mediterranean. It means that one of the important objectives of that action plan is to promote the goal to protect 30% of the Mediterranean Sea, and including 10% under strict protection by 2030. So this is one of the main elements of that action plan. Second axis, we have to do something regarding a sustainable management of the fish stocks, which is the second axis of that PAMEX. The important thing is to fight against illegal fishing, overfishing, with the European Union, which has a very important strategy. And so we should implement measures in order to fight against this EU fishing activities. And so we need to reinforce the good management and control measures in the Mediterranean Sea. The third axis, which is very important for the Mediterranean Sea, is our efforts to combat marine pollution, and particularly the plastic. Plastic is a big challenge for all the countries and all the regional organizations. So we need to foster actions for international, regional, national level, involving all the stakeholders, private and public sector, in order to increase our management of the plastic and to combat the production and consumption of plastic. So this is the third element and the third axis of this action plan. And the fourth one, which is a very important one for the Mediterranean Sea, is the sustainability of maritime transportation. So really we have to work, especially with at the local level, in the ports, in order for having, for instance, electrification in the ports. It's really important to have this, I should say, eco-infrastructure in order to fight against pollution. So we presented that action plan on the 3rd of September, just before the opening ceremony of the IUCN World Congress. And so now we will try to promote this action plan among countries. The important thing is to have all the Mediterranean countries around this action plan. So it means that we need to open this action plan to the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, because all the issues that I've raised are shared by all the countries, not only the western countries of the Mediterranean Sea, but also the eastern countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I, for one, was very excited during the opening ceremony of hearing Prime Minister Mitsotakis from Greece aligning himself on these targets. And thank you to friends who take the lead in this, because that's something that could really make a difference to the way, to the problems we have been depicting before. Now, I'm going to give just a quick second round. Is there any remark that you would like to make instantly after what you've just heard? We start with you. I must say that the Capitals Coalition is engaged into a program about agriculture, which is not yet used in the Mediterranean, but which is showing some really interesting segues. So maybe you want to comment on this.
I wanted to comment on something else, to be honest, but maybe I can weave in agriculture too. Let's see how that goes. So the thing, I mean, I like bubbles. Let's start that way. But in my glass, and not when you are dealing with problems. And to be honest, I still think we are in a huge bubble, and so we all agree in the same direction. But then, when we really want to change how the system works, we stumble into problems. So let's take just one example. It's what we need to change are the incentives. The incentives that currently are in the system do not support the right outcomes. So how does it work? Now business, I'm part of Business for Nature, we say we want better incentives that reward nature positive outcomes. I worked for 30 years within the Dutch government. I know what will happen in the Netherlands and probably in many countries, because business is throwing it over the hedge to the governments, ask governments to change incentives. The governments make beautiful plans, and then governments face within their political system that the majority of business is saying this is not a good idea, vested interests are different. And even though the community, the business community is growing with a voice to call for change, I'm not certain, to be honest, that it's enough. So, and my question on this would be, and Akanksha mentioned that we need to collaborate. I think we need radical collaboration. And so I'm just picking this a term from Nigel Topping, who's the UK ambassador for climate change. And to me, radical collaboration means bringing together in a specific region, maybe around an MPA, bring together business, finance and governments, the policymakers, to together design the policies and the incentive changes that are needed, and then present it together to society as this is what we need to do. If we don't do this, if we keep on just throwing things over hedges to the other side, it's not going to work. So maybe Akanksha or someone else could build on this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just, then I'll pass it on. But no, great point. I do want to highlight something that Akanksha brought up, or two things actually, is the finance piece, because that's what we're really talking about. Who's going to pay for this? I mean, who at the moment, like the stewards of the land, the smallholder producers, the large scale producers, the farmers. So if you're just talking about the agriculture, and that has an impact on the sea, of course, they're taking on all the risk. So in this transition, however it is, there has to be a support of that movement towards a more regenerative, restorative system, and then we can support it to a certain extent as companies, and we can support it in our supply chains. But ultimately, if we want to be transformative and really replicate this and bring this to scale, there's got to be financial. There's got to be financial incentives. There's got to be investment. So I'm bringing the finance to the table. I think for years we've developed a lot of great approaches in conservation to bring multi-stakeholder collaboration, insights, and on landscapes, and we can build on that. But the piece that's always missing is the money. The sustainable, ongoing financial, and I think that's where the innovation is in building these blended finance approaches to support this transition, whether it's in the grape production or whether it's in the fisheries in this region. I think there's a really important opportunity there, and I'm really excited. That actually really excites me, because I think that can make change happen really quickly. But I did want to just underline that when we talk about nature positive, it is meant to be in an equitable way, and there's these stewards of the land, these people that are taking on the risk, but also can turn that to an opportunity for themselves, for their well-being, if we support them, and their livelihoods is a really important element of this. So I just wanted to underline that.
Thanks, Helen. I think I will build on what Helen said, and I couldn't agree more with you. In the vision that Marco so eloquently laid out earlier, there is a plan for transition. We need to be also a bit more practical, that the world is not going to change tomorrow. Incentives are not going to change tomorrow. So there is going to be a transition phase and a prioritization phase. So I very much like the idea that till the time we get there, where business as usual is nature positive, which will take maybe a decade if we are being realistic, until then, how do we prioritize? So do we come up with, say, some critical ecosystems or biodiversity hotspots that you were saying, André, and bring together a coalition of people who can recognize incentives, blended finance models, and put it at the table? I think one not so popular tool, but can be looked at it as a solution, is of course on carbon markets or natural capital markets. And the problem to date is that the natural capital markets hasn't gotten to the ground, bringing money to the farmers and the communities. So one of the pieces that we are exploring is, if you start looking at Southeast Asia or ASEAN and create a natural capital market which is interoperable across the countries. So as of now, Singapore has announced its carbon exchange. There is discussion of Vietnam and Indonesia also announcing, but that region is so interconnected that if you have every country doing a carbon exchange program, does it really work? Instead, if you could think about an Asia-Pacific or an ASEAN-wide natural capital market where you have interoperable but creditable points that you can give to companies, have the right mechanisms which technology frankly can now afford to bring to the ground the money to the communities, there is something we can do. So carbon tax is just one option. It has worked in countries like Costa Rica, in Colombia. We just need to bring that mechanism to other countries as well, but not forgetting the equitable part of it. Like I love saying that today we have increased so much extraction of resources, and yet 860 million people in the world lack electricity. So, I mean, let's not forget the equity, but let's also remember that we need radical collaboration. It will not happen in one go. Let's identify what are the top 5 ecosystems we want to focus on between now and 2030, and then let's just make it happen. But we also need to get the politics right of it, right? Because till the time the leaders are at the table, this will not happen. So I think we just all need to do this together.
And you notice we're all looking at you. Do you want to reply to this?
Now, there is a thing which is quite important regarding the Mediterranean Sea is the political instability, especially in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. I remember when we start thinking about an action plan. I went to the department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France in order to get some clarification regarding the political panorama on that region. And they say to me, be modest, try to make it simple, smooth, cautious, try to negotiate with the western part because it will be easier, because we won't have difficulties with some political interferences. So this is something which is quite important regarding the investment also. We really need to make everyone on board, all the countries, all the governments. But I'm quite optimistic because during the negotiation of that action plan, I was expecting a lot of difficulties. And I've observed that the countries are quite consensual regarding the question of loss of biodiversity. I mean, the negotiation of the action plan was not so difficult. We had a lot of convergences regarding what to do. The question is how we can act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Before we go into question of the audience, just Marco, if there is an unscripted comment, nothing that we have prepared, something that comes from the guts, you know.
I never prepared anything, as you know. No. First of all, thank you. I mean, it's been a great set of inputs. Let me just say a couple of things. Bring it more to the beginning of my intervention. We've never been so clear about the impact we are having, and we've never been so clear about the consequences it's having, not just on our world, but on ourselves. So that's a massive cultural shift that is connecting nature conservation, climate stability to us. It's not anymore an ethical, moral thing only. It's actually a material issue for us. Economy, health, well-being, social stability. So this is, I think we should stop and reflect on this, because it's never happened in our civilization until now. We've taken nature for granted. Now we are beginning to stop taking nature for granted and value it. Not enough, not clearly enough, not the metrics yet, but culturally that shift is happening, and it is massive. That's the foundation for everything else, as you know. Unless you change your culture and your approach, you don't change your behavior. So I'm very excited about this, I have to say. This is an historic moment for our civilization. Then there is the issue of, the problem is very clear. The destination is beginning to be clear. On climate clearly is, on nature is not. And the clarity on destination is fundamental to focus on the transition, because you can't focus on the transition if you don't know where you want to go. So on carbon neutral, because that transition on climate is, the destination on climate is so clear, the transition is clear as well, and it's beginning to be clear. And I have to say, it's a question of finance, absolutely. But more than the lack of, is about redirection of, because finance is there, money are there, we are growing, our economy is growing. Look what happens with the COVID, right? Response. If we want, we can find the money and we can redirect the money towards in the right direction. And that's where we need to focus, for sure. But first, I really think we got to clarify our destination. It has to be automatic in our daily behaviors, in the way we invest our money, in the way we vote, in the way we teach our kids, in the way companies look at their supply chain, the way governments set up policies. It needs to be automatic that we need to do things that lead to a stable climate and a restored nature. If that is not on the back of our mind in everything we do, including how we organize a congress like this, we won't get there. So that goal, that destination is still for me fundamental. And then the rest will come, and I completely agree with you, and the representative of the French government. Then a combination of corporate investment, corporate plans, and government policies together will actually get us there.
Yeah, you mentioned the pandemic. I mean, Dr. Tedros had said that very clearly. We are all in this together. I mean, this is a common challenge. I mean, in fact, the future is sustainable or there is no future. It's as simple as that. Anyway, you agree with me that there is a very exciting panel here. So now we're expecting your questions. So who wants to ask a question? We have a microphone for the room, or we have Luis will tell us a couple of. Do you have questions coming from the web?
Yeah, thank you. So we have in our chat one question to Mrs. Akanksha KHATRI, which is how the private sector can contribute more to changing the consumption patterns, because without consumers' alignment and support, this transformation change will not happen. So that's a question for you, please.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because it's such a chicken and egg, or seems like chicken and egg, because it's citizens who demand consumption and then the private sector which supplies that for that consumption needs. But I think maybe if I just take it again to a macroeconomic fundamental, our economy today is driven by number of transactions. Whether it is a particular company, a product, or anything, it's defined by the number of transactions, and that consumption-fueled economy needs to change, or it needs to shift towards a sustainable consumption-fueled economy. So I would argue that there are enough and more companies which are showing the way. I think Helen is here, who are understanding the value of sustainability in their product, both for the brand recall, but also the choice that consumers make. The second thing is how companies choose to bring their product to the market. There is also the definition of recognizing that a lot of the things that we source are seasonal. We should not be eating the same food throughout the year. We've just gotten so used to it, we don't even recognize what fruits and vegetables today are seasonal. So one example that I would like to give is of Natura, which is a global cosmetics and wellness company. There are their product lines which require sourcing a particular cacao or a particular nut butter from the region in Amazon. And that particular product line is only available seasonally. Why? Because the nature provides that ingredient seasonally. So I think there is things that the companies can do to educate consumers, but then you also need almost that ping pong with consumers to respond to it and recognize this always on and always needing everything doesn't work. Let's recognize what we are putting on our body and inside our body in response to the environment that we live in.
Martin is going to take on that theme.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I want to also add to this consumer question, because transparency on the value of nature for consumers, for business and for government is so important, but for all three of these. And I just want to highlight three of the targets in the post-2020 a global biodiversity framework that is on the table right now. That is the targets 14, 15 and 16 that form together a kind of a triptych around this awareness raising and becoming transparent, demanding from governments that they have all the regulation and the policies in place that both government, business and consumers can have this transparent information. And I think this interconnectedness of these three targets really is important to stress. And from Business for Nature on these three specific targets, we have provided several suggestions to improve the text to ensure that it's seen as really three targets together.
I think in general, the way forward is quite well charted. I think at international level, we have spoken about this issue long enough. The question, and this is the reason why we have this panel today, is how we translate that to the region, how we translate that to the Mediterranean region, but also to every country in the world or every region of the world where it is needed. Does anybody else want to comment on this, or do we go for another question? Anybody in the audience? Yeah, here comes the microphone.
Thank you. one of the structural characteristics of the Mediterranean is the obvious north-south divide. It's not a very equitable context at all. And most of the solutions that were discussed today, particularly the policy discussion, the solutions like the EU Green Deal, the EU fisheries policy, and even some economic incentive solutions really only apply in the short term to the north. I would like to know how you address this. Maybe the French action plan or French-led action plan is a first step, but as you've said, very modest in ambition. How do you address this? Taking the calendar 2030 and what we need to achieve.
So you can choose who takes it, okay?
Okay. I'll let you go first if you want.
Okay, so this is a question of dialogue and cooperation between the North and the South. I think with the European Union and with this new Commission, I have the feeling that there is a high level of effort in order to address and tackle this question of loss of biodiversity. So I'm quite optimistic regarding these exchanges between the North and the South, and the fact that we can apply some good solutions in the southern part of the Mediterranean Sea. But let's see on practice what will happen. And my second observation is we really need to have a multi-partenarial effort. I mean, we need public and private efforts. We need a good cooperation between the private sector and the public sector, and so we have this kind of blended finance that you propose to do. Thank you.
Maybe I just want to put an innovative idea out there. So I fully agree with this north-south divide, which exists in the region but exists globally as well. But the reason that divide exists because our economic assets today are purely financial or produced capital. Would that divide still exist if we were able to put natural capital and natural capital assets on the balance sheet of a country and a company? So again, we need to rethink and put natural capital on the balance sheet and to find financial instruments which can leverage that natural capital asset to bring prosperity to people and the region. So again, just something which will not happen tomorrow, but is that a world we can imagine for 2030 and 2050?
And I just add one thing about the framing. I mean, after 20 years in conservation and 10 years in corporate sustainability, and it's all about, it's culture. They say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So it's all about, so how do you bring people along? What I think is so powerful about this moment, and Marco talked about this, is the framing about the outcomes that we all want. Instead of saying, oh, we need to do sustainable this and we need to do that, it's like telling people what you need to do, but instead it's getting together and say, well, what's the outcome that you want? We don't want to live in a region that has bushfires it's my Australian psychometric, well, bushfires or wildfires every summer, or that have these crazy temperatures. We want to be able to fish, we want to be able to grow our grapes, so I think we've got to build a collaboration and a dialogue. We can call it natural capital, or we can also talk about the outcomes that we want, the sort of society, the vibrancy that we want. And I think that can align people in a way that we haven't been able to do that before. And it's not about what you do, it's about what we all want. And I don't want to be naive about it, but I do think we have to be framing this really carefully and appropriately so that everyone can be part of this discussion.
Absolutely. So just a point, because I think your point is super valid. And when we talk about outcomes, we also need to talk about measurable outcomes. And I think that's where we're still a little bit behind. On climate, the metrics are super clear. We can count climate contribution or not through a CO2 equivalent metric. On nature, we need to come quickly to clear metrics, because a company cannot otherwise include that into their business plans, and a government cannot really push other governments to comply. And simply on nature today, there is no accountability, because there are no outcomes, there's no goal, there's no outcomes, and there are no metrics acknowledged. This is the opportunity of this year. This year and the Convention on Biological Diversity next year is the opportunity, we hope, we're pushing very hard, for the world to agree on a goal, on the outcomes, and on the metrics. And once we've done that, we have a plan. And then it's a question to bring everybody on board.
Well, thank you very much again to the outstanding panel. I'm just going to say 2 sentences and then you can clap for them, so prepare yourself. What I really do find exciting of what we have seen today is this sort of I share Marco's excitement about the historical moment we're living through. You know, what you've just defined about accountability of nature, the president of WWF, Pavan Sukhdev, has had this very good remark. You know, we use nature because it's for free. We lose it because it's priceless. And I think there's a very profound way of looking at this. For those of you who have perhaps seen me since the beginning of the Congress, I'm going to repeat the same thing. In 1974, when I first attended an ICN conference, we only talked about the big animals in Africa. Today, it's such a joy to see people from all walks of life, people from government, people from international organizations, people from NGOs, and people from business sitting together and talking about common future. We are not going to survive in a planet in which the natural system doesn't function. So when we talk about the dramatic changes, it's not just a change at public life; it's also a change at private life. I think there's going to be a lot of changes in the near future. And if I can just finish on one sentence which I've tweeted last week to make sure that everybody gets it, and now I've lost it. Anyway, we will only get somewhere if we work collectively. You know, the future will have to include a solution where we all work together, and that's civil society, public society, NGOs, scientists, governments, corporations. Well, I expect some of the big corporations who are sponsored here will survive the change, but a lot of the big corporations we know, household names we deal with every day, will disappear because they haven't realized the stress of what's coming to them. Anyway, thank you very much for having stayed with us for such a long time. We're a couple of minutes overdue. Now is the applause. Thank you.
Brilliant remarks. Brilliant.